Like the cerebellum chapter, the basal ganglia chapter has tons of information that we are not going to go into. We're not going to talk about the specific nuclei, even though some of them are listed in this PowerPoint. We're just going to gloss over that and say it's a group of specific nuclei that do some specific things. So we're going to talk about the basic function. And the only learning objective for this part of the lecture is what are the major roles of the basal ganglia? Okay, so that's what I want you to get out of this. Don't worry about the individual parts of the basal ganglia. So just as a little orientation, the basal ganglia, basal has to do with the location. It's at the base of the brain. Ganglia is a group of neurons. So it's several groups of neurons that are located at the base of the cerebrum or within the diencephalon that predict the effects of various actions and then make and execute action plans. So the basal ganglia have functions in motor effects, executive, so decision-making effects, and other non-motor things. So we'll briefly talk about them. All these nuclei, it's great. There's a list of them. You do not need to memorize those. Don't spend any time memorizing the nuclei in the basal ganglia. Okay? Just tell you that right now. So a lot of the names of the basal ganglia are listed here. There's a little picture of it. I think it's cool looking, and it's anything right in the middle of the brain, like the thalamus and the basal ganglia. It's important. That's all we're going to say about that. So you're not going to be responsible for the anatomical orientation to the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia, there are a lot of neurotransmitters that are produced in the basal ganglia. There are cortical motor areas that produce excitation of areas of the basal ganglia with the neurotransmitter glutamate. Remember, glutamate is the major excitatory neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. Dopamine is produced in the substantia nigra area of the basal ganglia. And it adjusts signals from the output nuclei, and the output nuclei provide the appropriate level of inhibition to their target nuclei. So you can think of the basal ganglia as being a sort of a control point, if that makes sense. So it's inhibiting motor actions. It's inhibiting other actions. I'm going to talk more about that. So this is just a little cross section, a coronal section of a brain, and the dark part, the sort of dark little V right in the middle, is called the substantia nigra, which means it's short for substantia nigra pars compacta, and basically it means dark area, dark substance. So that dark substance is where the dopamine is being produced. It's where the neurons that produce the dopamine live. So in cross sections of people's brains, clearly done after they were dead, who have Parkinson's disease, the substantia nigra is significantly lighter. Those dopamine producing neurons that cause that dark pigmentation have died off in Parkinson's disease. So the basal ganglia motor circuits regulate muscle contraction, muscle force, multi-joint movements, and the sequence of movements. The basal ganglia has a profound effect on movement, but it has no direct output to motor neurons. It exerts its output through the motor thalamus, which then influences the prefrontal cortex. The basal ganglia regulates contraction of postural and girdle muscles. It elicits rhythmical lower limb movement similar to walking or running. So that's the motor part of the basal ganglia. They're also involved in decision making, judgment, prioritizing information, emotional processing and responses, learning, eye movement, spatial attention, and motor output. Hugely important things that the basal ganglia are involved in. So we have these little nuclei of neurons that are doing all these super important things in our nervous system. So the main thing, though, is that regulation of the contraction of muscles and the sequencing of movements. So it's controlling movement, and it's inhibiting unwanted movements. So a lot of times with basal ganglia dysfunction, you're going to have a tremor. The tremor is the unwanted movement. So the unwanted movement is not being eliminated or not being inhibited. So we talk about motor loops and non-motor loops, and there's tons of information about the loops in the book that you don't need to know about. So the motor functions of the basal ganglia have to do with smoothing out our movements and preventing unwanted movements and organizing our movements. The basal ganglia involvement in non-motor functions has 3 different loops that they talk about. You don't need to know those, but they contribute to the prediction of future events. So you're coming up to a stoplight, and it's turning yellow, it's about to turn red, and you're looking at the traffic in the area, and the basal ganglia is taking all that information in and predicting what's going to happen if you run that light, what's going to happen if you stop. And it's preventing undesired behavior. So the undesired behavior would probably be running into another car. The non-motor loops are involved in motor learning, shifting attention, and spatial working memory. So that the intersection with the changing light is a great example of spatial working memory. You have to store all this constantly changing information in your spatial working memory and make a decision about what you need to do in this situation. You can imagine how basal ganglia dysfunction might affect your function in day-to-day life. So even though the basal ganglia have profound effects on movement, they have no direct output to motor neurons. The motor loop regulates 3 activities in 3 pathways. So it regulates voluntary muscle activity. It regulates postural and girdle muscle activity. So non-voluntary muscle activity, basically, and walking. So those are the things that are often affected, the motor area that's affected when you have basal ganglia dysfunction. So you have problems with voluntary muscle activity, you have problems with postural girdle, and so posture and stability, and you have problems with walking. So the motor loop is dependent on dopamine, which is supplied by the substantia nigra pars compacta. So the basal ganglia inhibit the motor thalamus and a couple other nuclei. So in a normal neuromotor system, the inhibition is decreased or increased depending on the desired movement. So it's sort of like putting on the brakes or taking off the brakes. We're controlling the movement. The movement's being generated elsewhere, but this motor loop is using the dopamine that's in your system to inhibit the motor thalamus to selectively decrease or increase the movement depending on what you want to do. So it's like fine-tuning. You're fine-tuning things with your basal ganglia. So really what you should know is they're a group of interconnected nuclei located in the cerebrum and midbrain, right in the middle of the brain. The basal ganglia pathologies cause a spectrum of movement disorders. If you don't have that input and that inhibition and control from the basal ganglia, then you can't move correctly. Basal ganglia also regulate goal-directed behavior, social behavior, emotions, and oculomotor control. So That's huge. And we'll see when we start to talk about basal ganglia disorders, it will make sense how these things come into play. I hope.